Hey class, Mr. Swanside here. So we just did a quick review of the early Dakota. Now we're going to jump into talking about the early Ojibwe. So again, similar to the video for early Dakota, there might be some different things that you learn. So take good notes, and tomorrow when we're in class, we'll work on a study guide together. Have fun. The learning objectives for this chapter will be 1. To describe the traditional story of the Ojibwe migration to Minnesota. 2. Define human capital and provide a connection between this economics term and traditional Ojibwe lifeways. 3. Explain the seasonal round of Ojibwe life, including changes in location, foods, work, play, and community size. 4. Provide examples of importance of nature in Ojibwe life. 5. Name some ways modern Ojibwe continue to keep traditions alive today. And 6. Define sovereignty. The history of the Ojibwe migration to the western Great Lakes region is a long-standing part of Ojibwe oral history. The stopping places along the way have been corroborated through archaeological work and through descriptions written by Europeans who came in contact with the Ojibwe during the late 1500s and early 1600s. It is not known exactly when the Ojibwe began migrating westward in small groups, but most believe the move was slow and took place over the course of several hundred years. There exists a difference of opinion as to the reason for the migration. Some say prophecy, while others say it was American Indian population density along the East Coast, or the arrival of Europeans, or even some combination of these reasons. Not all of the Ojibwe moved as far west as Minnesota. Some stayed in what is now northern Wisconsin in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Others migrated to Canada and settled in the provinces of Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Later, some of these groups continued west through Canada and moved south into northern North Dakota. The Ojibwe are one of the largest American Indian groups in North America, with significant populations on both sides of the United States-Canada border. That being said, the story that we read about in the text says this. One important Ojibwe story is about the migration from their original home near the Atlantic Ocean to the shores of Lake Superior. The story begins many years ago when the Ojibwe's ancestors still lived near the ocean. It goes something like this. One day, 7 prophets appeared among the Ojibwe and forecast the future. One of the prophets predicted that the people would soon leave their homes beside the ocean and travel to a far-off land where food grows on water. The journey was to be a long one, the prophet said, and would require the people to make 7 stops along the way. The Ojibwe's ancestors eventually did leave their homes in the east. They headed west along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, just as the prophet predicted. They stopped for long periods at 7 different places during their journey. At one point in their travels, the people split into 3 groups. The southern group traveled west until they reached the Squamigan Bay in what is now northern Wisconsin. Later, some of those who traveled north around the lake joined them. There, the Ojibwe found marshes brimming with wild rice, which they called Manoman. The prophet's vision of a land where food grows on water had come true. The Ojibwe's long journey with the 7 stops was over. By the mid-1600s, they were living along the western shores of Lake Superior in areas that are now part of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Rounded wood frame wigwams were one-room Ojibwe homes covered with birch bark or animal hides. The Ojibwe probably brought their wigwam design with them when they migrated away from the eastern forests. Animal hides served as doors that were tied back during warm weather to allow air to circulate in the houses. Mats woven from reeds collected in marshes often covered wigwam floors. A fire pit inside was vented with a hole in the roof and surrounded by large logs or stones to prevent the fire from spreading. Stones also absorbed heat from the fire, which helped keep the home warm. In winter, gaps and holes in the siding were put together with moss, and outside walls were banked with snow and cedar boughs to prevent cold air from entering. Although wigwams were the primary housing type, the Ojibwe also built several other seasonal dwellings. These included teepees for traveling, rectangular bark lodges for the maple sugar camps, and other types of lodges for ceremonies. As with other American Indian groups, the name Ojibwe people use sometimes differs from names used by people outside the tribe. The origin of Ojibwe is unknown, but may have referred to their traditional puckered moccasins. Additional spellings include Ojibwe, which is Ojibwa, and Ojibwe, Ojibway. The term Anishinabe, which means original people, in the Ojibwe language is also used to refer to this group. In addition, some Ojibwe people use Anishinabe to refer to all American Indians, Ojibwe, Dakota, and so on. The U.S. government often uses the word Chippewa in connection with the Ojibwe. This word is a mispronounced version of Ojibwe. It came about when Europeans initially met the Ojibwe and misunderstood how to say the name. Read about human capital and how it relates to the Ojibwe lifeways. Press pause, and then when you're done, move on to the next slide. Melting snow and ice marked the beginning of spring. As the weather turned warmer, Ojibwe families packed their belongings onto sleds and toboggans and left the protective pine forests where they had spent the winter. They traveled to where the maple trees grew. This was their sugar camp, where the Ojibwe turned sap from the maples into sugar and syrup. As friends and relatives reunited, they began the hard work of preparing enough food and supplies for the next winter. Once the families arrived at the sugar camp, they repaired existing lodges and built new ones. Some were used as homes and others as workplaces. While the men went out to hunt, the women began the process of making maple sugar. They went through the maple grove, cutting a gash in the trunk of each tree. Then they inserted a wooden spout into each gash. Before long, sap began dripping from the spout and into a birch bark container. Then came the job of turning the sap into sugar. From sunrise to sunset, boys and girls ran back and forth, delivering containers of sap to the sugar house. The sugar house was a large structure made of wooden poles and covered with bark. Inside, the children poured the sap into kettles set over burning fires. As the sap boiled down, it turned into sugar. As a reward for their work, the children were allowed to eat some of the sugar. The older women stored the remaining sugar in birch bark containers for later use. The sugar would provide energy throughout the year. Another important springtime task was making canoes. First, the Ojibwe constructed a frame from cedar, a strong but lightweight wood. Then they wrapped birch bark around the bottom and sides of the frame and sewed it tight using twine made of spruce roots. Lastly, they sealed the seams in the bark with spruce gum. Women did some of this work, while men did other parts. Young boys and girls helped too, learning the craft from their elders. By the time the Ojibwe finished making maple syrup, summer was nearly upon them. They packed their belongings into birch bark canoes and headed for their summer village sites. These were usually located near rivers or lakes. The bark-covered dwellings looked much like the sugar houses in the maple groves. In the summer villages, Ojibwe families could enjoy life as members of a larger community. They gathered together for ceremonial feasts and dances. They also played games, especially what is known as lacrosse. Lacrosse was a popular team sport. Both men and women had teams. It was played on a large open field, often with spectators. All players carried sticks with a pouch on the end. They used those sticks to catch and throw a leather ball. The team that put the most balls through its opponent's goalposts won the game. Summer was also the time when women planted and tended crops, especially corn, which they called mundaman. They also raised pumpkins, squash, and potatoes. When the women weren't tending their gardens, they turned their attention to wild foods, especially fruits. During the summer, the forests were rich with strawberries, juneberries, raspberries, blackberries, cherries, grapes, cranberries, and blueberries. The men rarely hunted in the summer. They knew it was best to leave deer, elk, and other animals alone while they took care of their young. This helped prevent animals from becoming scarce in future years. Summer was a time for men to travel, trading, and occasionally engaging in battle with their neighbors. After harvesting their crops, the Ojibwe left their summer villages and once again set out for a new destination. In the fall, they went to the ponds, marshes, and lakes where wild rice grew. The seeds, or grain from wild rice plants, were among the Ojibwe's favorite foods and the focus of their lives during the days of early autumn. Since the rice grew in water, the Ojibwe harvested it from canoes. Each canoe had 2 people in it. The person in back pushed the canoe through the rice fields using a long pole. The person in front bent the stalks and tapped the grain heads with the stick until the rice fell into the canoe. After hours of work, the grain heaped up in the bottom. Often children helped in the harvest, learning from their elders how to gather rice properly. Once the rice was harvested, it was time to head back to shore and prepare the rice for storage. Those who did not take part in the rice harvest kept busy with other autumn tasks. Children collected late-season berries and dried them for use during winter. Men hunted the ducks and geese that flocked to the rice marshes during the fall. Men and women caught fish and preserved them for the coming winter. Winter was a time of quiet and seclusion. Each family group lived in their own cluster of wigwams, many miles away from their nearest neighbors. They spread out across great distances like this because food was scarce during the winter. Each section of forest could support only a small number of people. The Ojibwe prepared all year for the winter. Their supplies of wild rice, sugar, and dried fish helped sustain them in the cold winter months. As long as the weather allowed, the men and boys hunted and trapped to get fresh meat for their families. The best hunters were often away from home for days at a time, hunting large animals such as moose, deer, and elk. The children and older men often trapped and hunted smaller animals, helping keep the families supplied. While the family's men and boys hunted, the women and girls had their own winter tasks. They cooked all the meals. They also made jackets, leggings, moccasins, and other clothes from the animal hides they had prepared during warmer months. Older women wove fishing nets and hunting bags, helped with the cooking, and looked after the small children. When the children were done with their chores, they found many ways to have fun. They slid down hills on toboggans and tree bark. They tied snowshoes to their feet and raced each other through the woods. Sometimes they played a game called Snow Stake. The Dakota and Ojibwe didn't always get along, at least initially. Sometimes they fought, and other times they traded with one another and feasted together. In 1679, at a gathering near present-day Duluth, the two sides formed an alliance, which is an agreement made between two or more nations or allies to cooperate for specific reasons. They remained at peace with one another for many years after making this agreement. The Dakota allowed the Ojibwe to move farther west into what is now northern Minnesota. This was the land that had traditionally been Dakota territory. In return, the Ojibwe agreed to supply the Dakota with new types of trade goods, such as tools, cloth, weapons, and more. What does it mean when we say sovereign? Sovereign means self-ruling and independent. Hit pause, read this, and when you're done, move on to the next slide. For your reflection, answer the questions: how are the Ojibwe different from the Dakota? How are they the same?